Good day, everyone. Now let us discuss Chapter 1 of Reading in Philippine History, which is Introduction to History, Definition, Issues, Sources, and Methodology. First, definition and subject matter. History has always been known as the study of the past. For some, it is considered as notorious for its just merely memorization of dates, places, and names and events from the distant eras that gives a shallow understanding to its respective context and its relevance to people's lives. Karamihan sa mga kabataan ngayon ay takot sa pag-aaral ng history. Bakit? Kasi yung perspektibo nila about dito is memorya, pagmemorya ng mga nangyari sa sinaunang panahon. So, doon sila kumbaga panatatakot kasi napakaraming mga events na dapat mong pakatandaan. So, this shallow understanding or definition or perspective about history, we should replace that because history has a different meaning to our lives on the importance of our to human civilization. So maraming kumbaga pa magandang naidulot ang nangyari sa sinuunang panahon sa present day natin ngayon. So yun yung dapat nating ma-appreciate at pakakatandaan at hindi lamang sa pagmemorya ng mga dates, places or events na nangyari noon. So, history was derived from a Greek word, historia, which means knowledge acquired through inquiry or investigation. So, yung mga nangyari noon o yung mga events or situations na nangyari noon, hindi siya matatawag na historical document or historical evidences kung hindi siya dumaan sa tamang proseso ng research o pag-iimbestiga. So, kailangan, yung mga ginagawa ng historians dati is nagsasagawa sila ng investigasyon patungkol sa isang pangyayari o sitwasyon para masabi nila na, okay, this situation is valid. This artifact is should be considered as historical. Okay? So, historians write about the lives of important individuals like monarchs, heroes, saints, and nobilities. It was also focused on the writings about wars, revolutions, and other important breakthroughs for about 2,400 years ago. Alright, so yung mga, kumbaga pa, historical documents or historical evidences na isinasagawa ng mga historians ay patungkol sa mga buhay ng mga tao dati, monarchs, heroes, and saints. Pero hindi lang naman doon, patungkol din, yung history ay patungkol din sa wars, revolutions, and other important happenings before. Alright, traditional historians lived with the mantra of no document, no history. So, ito yung, kumbaga pa, ito yung life philosophical ng mga historians dati na kapag walang dokumento, hindi siya matatawag o masasabi na history. So, it means that unless a written document can prove a certain historical event, then it cannot be considered as a historical fact. Okay, so yun yung mantra ng mga historians dati. But then, as time goes by, may loophole na nakita yung mga historians. Kasi, dati kasi, meron tayong tinatawag na caste system. Okay, meron tayong higher class, lower class, at higher class, middle class, and lower class. So, dati kasi sinuunang panahon, yung higher class lang mismo yung may privilege na maaaring makapag-registered sa mga government or maaaring makapagkuha ng mga photographs. How about the people na lower class o yung mga mahihirap? So, wala silang government records na tinatawag. So, wala silang written documents. So, ibig sabihin ba nun is hindi sila kasali sa history? So, yun yung loophole na nakikita ng mga historians dati na kapag wala daw dokumento, walang history. So, yung mga mahirap kasi dati is hindi sila, hindi sila nakakapag-registered ng mga pangalan nila sa government. Wala man lang sila mga pictures or mga traces dati kasi hindi nila ma-afford dahil sa kahirapan. So, yung ginawa ng mga historians is merong mga So, yung inisip ng mga historians ngayon na yung valid historical sources can be in a form written or by word of the mouth, since not all civilizations have kept written records like the peasant families or indigenous groups who were not given much thought about being registered to government records. So, ito yung sinasabi ko. Dahil nga sa kahirapan, may mga sinaunang tao dati na walang historical records kasi nga hindi nila afford dati. Yung mga mayayaman lang yung maikaya. So, ito yung loophole na nakita ng mga historians as time goes by. A few of these examples are traditions in forms of epics and songs, artifacts, architectures, and memory. So, yung ginawa nila, hindi na lamang sila nakabatay sa mga dokumento. Okay? So, dinisregard nila yung mantra nila na no document, no history. So, dinisregard nila yon kasi yung pinagbatayan na lang nila is yung mga traditions na meron yung mga tao dati, yung mga epic songs, yung mga epics and songs, artifacts, architectures, and memory. So, ito yung isang ibang historical evidences na nakalap ng mga historians. Alright, and now, let's proceed to questions and issues in history. History is the study of the past, the events that happened in the past, the causes of such events, and history itself, which leads to history as a discipline, a complex and dynamic inquiry that produces various perspectives regarding different questions like, what is history? Why study history? And history for whom? Okay, so history does not only focus on memorizing dates, places, and events, but in history is a complex discipline. Kasi kasi bilang isang mambabasa o bilang isang estudyante, kapag nagbabasa ka ng mga artifacts or yung mga historical events na nangyari dati, dapat maging critical thinker ka din. Isipin mo na, okay, is this kung yung events ba na binabasa mo is kumbaga pa dumadaan sa tamang proseso, yung sinasabi natin kanina na investigation. Dapat yung pagkakasunod-sunod ng mga pangyayari, dapat alam mo yun. Okay? So, history is a complex and dynamic inquiry. Okay? So, kumbaga pa complex siya at dynamic inquiry na marami kang tanong na maiisip. Bakit kailangang pag-aralan ng history? At para saan yung pag-aaral ng history? So, yung mga questions na to ay masasagutan sa pamamagitan ng histografiya or histography. Histography is the study of history. Histography does not just let you learn facts, but also provide better understanding about the historian context. Okay, so yung history, 'di ba? Kanina yung meaning o yung pinag-aralan natin kanina ng history is the study of the past. Okay, so while yung histografiya naman, okay, hindi lamang siya sa pag-aaral ng mga pangyayari sa sinuunang panahon, but then it will give us a better understanding about the historian context. It also includes deep analyzation and critical thinking in collecting important things, which can help to inspire people keep their good practices and be able to make sense of the present in the future. Okay, so in the 18th and 19th century, any history entails written documents to claim that a particular knowledge is true. This thought is called positivism. De Ilustrados like Jose Rizal, Isobelo de los Reyes, and Padre Paterno wrote history intended for the Spaniards for them to realize that Filipinos are of the people of their own intellect and culture. However, American historians find it uncivilized in their publications, and so Americans intended to justify their colonization of the islands not just by means of undermining the Philippine sovereignty, but a civilizing mission to fulfill what they called white man's burden. Okay, again, I just want to emphasize that historiography is the study of history itself. For example, for a certain historical evidences, some historians have a question in mind that who was a certain historical text written? Who wrote it? What was the context of its publication? What particular historical method was employed? And what were the sources used? Okay, so, kumbaga pa, ang histografiya is yung deeper questioning about history. Hindi lamang sa pagmemorya ng dates, so yung mga nangyari noon, but then a deeper understanding of what happened. Okay, so hindi lamang sa, kumbaga pa, sa mga nangyari, but then magka-question ang histografiya is yung pag-aaral din sa mga dahilan o yung dahilan at yung causes na nangyari sa isang sitwasyon nung nakaraan. Okay. So, let's proceed to history and the historian. Okay, so we all know that it is impossible to get an exact and accurate account of the past, for we cannot go back to the past. And so, history is written with agenda or is heavily influenced by the historian whom has the only access representation of the past through historical sources and evidences. Okay, so since hindi natin kumbaga pa mapoproven talaga na ito talaga yung nangyari dati, kasi hindi naman na tayo makakabalik pa sa nakaraan. So, hindi natin kumbaga pa makikita with our own eyes na ang isang pangyayari. Kasi, yung magiging batayan na lang natin is yung mga written documents na isinagawa ng mga historians. Okay? So, therefore, it is a historian's job not just to seek historical evidences and facts, but also to interpret these facts by giving meaning to these facts. Okay, so that's what we tackled. That's what we have discussed a while ago. Na yung history is all about inquiry or investigation of situations or events that happened in the past. Okay, so yung mga evidences nakikita ng mga historians, okay, nagbibigay sila dito ng interpretasyon or meaning sa mga facts na nakakalap nila and organize them into a timeline, establish causes, and write history. Alright, so a historian is influenced by his own context, environment, and ideology, education, and influences among others. This entails the methodology he will use, the relevance of the facts, and as well as the form of his writings. Moreover, history is always subjective and thus requires a rigor of research and historical methodology which comprises certain techniques and rules in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidences in writing history, like the rules applied in case of conflicting accounts in different sources. Alright, so since yung history is kumbaga pa napaka-broad niya, marami kang dapat pag-aralan you should consider the time, the places, people involved, okay? The scenarios, okay? So, kaya nga kumbaga pa, dahil sa maraming dapat isaalang-alang sa pag-aaral ng history, yung ginagawa ng mga historians is gumagawa sila ng timeline. Okay, gumagawa sila ng timeline to have a better understanding about the situations or evidences or facts that they have gathered about a certain situation that happened in the past. Alright. So, in that sense, historical claims and arguments in their historical writings influenced by the historians' inclinations were still valid because it is used reliable evidences and employed correct and meticulous historical methodology. Aside from that, when it is used as an oral account as data, then it needs to validate the claims by comparing and collaborating it with written sources to back up his claim, so that the historians will not be biased to his judgment. Alright, so kumbaga pa, yung historians, hindi lamang sila nakabase sa mga nakalap nilang mga impormasyon, but then, they are comparing it to the evidences or facts that the other historians have gathered. Okay? So, para hindi sila, kumbaga pa, maging bias sa decisions nila. Alright? So, at some point, history became inclusive and started collaborating with other disciplines like geography, anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics. Okay, so mas magiging maayos yung pangangalap nila at magiging, kumbaga pa, effective yung pangangalap nilang mga datos kung makipag-collaborate yung mga historians sa ibang eksperto ng disiplina like anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics. Okay, for example, in archaeology, with the aid of archaeologists, historians can use artifacts from a bygone era to study ancient civilizations that were formerly ignored in history because of lack of documents. In linguistics, linguists can also be helpful in tracing historical evolutions, past connections among different groups, and flow of cultural influence by studying language and the changes that it has undergone. Even in scientists like biologists and biochemists can help with the study of the past through analyzing genetic and DNA patterns of human societies. See how these disciplines help the historians to have a better understanding of or interpretation of the evidences or facts they have gathered para mas maayos yung kumbaga pa timeline na gagawin nila na pag-interpret sa mga nangyari nung sinaunang panahon. And now, let us proceed to historical sources. Historians' most important research tools are historical sources. Historical sources can be classified into primary and secondary sources. The classification of sources depends on the historical subject being studied, and not on the period when the source was produced or the type of the source. Alright, primary sources are sources produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. Most common examples are archival documents, artifacts, memorabilia, letters, census, and government records. For example, so to study the Commonwealth, for example, historians wishes to study Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935. As an example, primary sources can include the minutes of the convention, newspapers, clippings, Philippine Commission reports of the U.S. commissioners, records of the convention, the draft of the constitutions, and even photographs of the event. Okay, so ang mga historians dati, para magkaroon sila ng epektibo o o valid na mga ebidensya sa pangangalap ng mga datos, kailangan nila ng mga sources. At yung sources na to ay nahahati sa dalawa. Ito yung tinatawag na primary sources at secondary sources. Yung primary sources naman, ito yung sources na na-produce at the same time sa pangyayari ng during the event o period na pinapag-aralan. Halimbawa, dito yung example ng Commonwealth Constitution or Convention on 1935. So, yung primary sources na example dito, during this time, during this Commonwealth Convention, is yung newspapers, clippings, and reports during that time. So, yun yung mga primary sources o yung mga ebidensya during that time mismo o during that period mismo ng convention. So, yun yung primary sources. Alright, so on the other hand, secondary sources are sources produced by an author who use primary sources to produce the material. These are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. To concretize it further, on the subject of the Philippine Revolution of 1896, students can read Teodoro Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses. The Story of Bonifacio and Katipunan, published originally in 1956. The Philippine Revolution happened. Alright, so all this aside from that, all these textbooks are classified as a secondary sources. So yung secondary sources, ma-consider natin siya secondary sources kung gumagamit yung historians o yung author ng primary sources. Alright? So halimbawa ng secondary sources are textbooks or books, articles. Okay, so these are examples of secondary sources. So yung articles, halimbawa halimbawa gumawa ako ng article patungkol kay Jose Rizal. Okay, since my topic is all about the life of Jose Rizal, I will use some documents or other artifacts na naisagawa na dati. So kumbaga paggagamit ako ng mga primary sources to gain knowledge or to have details about Jose Rizal. So that will be yung magagawa kong output o kumbaga pa yung magagawa kong article, yan na yung tinatawag na secondary sources. Okay? Since I will use evidences or artifacts which is the primary sources, at yung output na magagawa ko will be the so-called secondary sources. Okay, so moreover, both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. And so, to avoid deception and to come up with the historical truth, historians and as well as the students of history need to thoroughly scrutinize these historical sources by conducting an external and internal criticism of the source, such as external criticism and internal criticism. External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and the materials used for the evidence, the quality of the paper and the type of the ink, and the language and words used in material are examples of the thing that will have to be examined when conducting external criticism. So, since we are studying history, um, not just me but as well as you guys are studying history kasi andito tayo sa subjects na to, we have to use external criticism all the time. Okay, so dapat i-practice natin tong external criticism. Hindi lamang dapat tayo nagbabalidate ng mga informations na babasa natin, dinadigest natin yon, but then we have to, kumbaga pa, maging critical tayo sa mga information na nababasa natin. Kung ito ba ay, kumbaga pa, tama, kung ito ba ay dumaan sa tamang proseso o sa tamang historical research na mako-consider nating valid. So, dapat maging critical tayo sa lahat ng mga nababasa nating impormasyon, lalong-lalo na kung ito ay nanggaling sa internet. Okay? So, next is the internal criticism. On the other hand, internal criticism is the examination of truthfulness and factuality of the evidence by looking at the author of the source, its context, the agenda behind its creation, the knowledge which is informed, and its intended purpose. Okay, so again, internal criticism, ito yung pag-aaral ng, kumbaga pa, deeper examination about the factuality of the evidence. Okay, so by looking at the author of the source, its context, the agenda behind its creation, the knowledge which informed it, and its intended purpose. Okay, that is internal criticism. While the external criticism, it is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and the material used for the evidence. Okay, so yun yung pinagkaiba nila. In addition, Philippine historiography underwent several changes. Since the pre-colonial period until the present, ancient Filipinos narrated their history through communal songs and epics that they passed orally from a generation to another. When the Spaniards came, their chroniclers started recording their observations through written accounts. The perspective of historical writing and inquiry also shifted. The Spanish colonizers narrated the history of their colony in a bipartite view. They saw the age before colonization as a dark period in the history of the island until they brought light through Western thought and Christianity. Early nationalists refuted this perspective and argued the tripartite view. They saw the pre-colonial society as a luminous age that ended with darkness when the colonizers captured their freedom. They believed that the light would come again once the colonizers were evicted from the Philippines. Philippine historian Zeus Salazar introduced the new guiding philosophy for writing and teaching history, pantayong pananaw, for us from us perspective. So this perspective highlights the importance of facilitating an internal conversation and discourse among Filipinos about our own history, using the language that is understood by everyone. So, kumbaga pa, yung Philippine historiography natin is from time to time nagbabago siya. Okay, so dati sa pre-colonial period, yung mga culture natin, yung history natin is nakabase lamang sa communal songs, sa epics, at sa mga, kumbaga pa, sa dances na isinasagawa natin. But then, nung dumating na yung mga colonizers, yung mga Spaniards, is inintroduce nila yung, kumbaga pa, inintroduce nila yung language and writings. Kaya from time to time, yung mga epics and songs natin is napapalitan na ng, kumbaga pa, modernization. But somehow, mas na-emphasize yung modernization nang dumating yung mga Americans. Okay? So, kumbaga pa, si Zeus Salazar Jesus Salazar yung nagbigay din ng importansya in facilitating an internal conversations and discourse among Filipinos about our own history using the language that is ever understood by everyone. So, dati kasi, kumbaga pa, iba-iba yung mga salita natin. Iba-iba yung mga salita natin dahil, kumbaga pa, yung bansang Pilipinas ay archipelago. Watak-watak na mga isla. Ibang pananalita at hindi tayo nagkakaintindihan. Kaya yung ginawa ni Jesus Salazar is um, nagbigay siya ng kaalaman ng pananalita kung saan meron tayong pagkakaintindihan o pagkakaisa na magkakaintindihan tayong mga Pilipino. Okay, so as time goes by, ang historiography is hindi lamang nakapokus sa isang diskurso, but then marami siyang pinapag-aralang ibang causes ng pangyayari sa sinaunang panahon. So, nagbabago at nagbabago siya depende sa kung ano yung environment na kinalalagyan ng Pilipinas dati. So, we are now done with the chapter 1 of this subject, and I hope na marami kayong natutunan sa araling ito, and be ready and wait for my announcement on, well, when will be the next schedule for our quiz and recitations will be are to be followed. All right, so thanks for listening and have a good day.